Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere oddly tender and unexpectedly romantic, a grimy Victorian prison where the air is musty, the cells are damp, and love somehow still manages to sneak through the bars. You're standing in the echoing corridor of a 19th century English jail. Yes, the kind where the windows are just slits and the food tastes like boiled sadness. Your boots squeak faintly on the stone floor, and you pause outside a rusted iron door. Inside, a prisoner leans over a makeshift desk, a wooden crate, and a dull candle stub, painstakingly composing a love letter in barely legible script, using ink made from soot and saliva. The walls around you groan with the weight of silent, unspoken stories. You're here for one of the softest, most unexpected ones, the story of postal love from inside prison walls. Victorian prisoners didn't have phones, no dating apps, and certainly no swipe-right fantasies, but what they did have, if they were lucky, was access to paper, something vaguely resembling ink, and a fragile connection to the outside world, and that's all they needed. But don't let the candlelit romance fool you. You probably wouldn't last a day in here. Cold, foul-smelling straw for a bed, 3 meals of questionable gruel, and the constant company of rats that look you in the eye like they pay rent. Victorian prisons weren't exactly a backdrop for rom-coms, and yet somehow the human heart remained stubbornly poetic. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and the time you're listening. I love seeing how far these sleepy tales travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step deeper into the prison wing, passing by crumbling bricks and whispered stories. Victorian England had no shortage of people behind bars. Some were locked away for theft, others for debt, and a good number for crimes as vague as loitering while suspicious. It was the golden age of prison expansion, when the British Empire, proudly inventing bureaucracy, decided that punishment should be grim, reform should be theatrical, and paperwork should be excessive. Inside these echoing stone mazes, prisoners were forbidden many things. Talking during work hours, reading novels, or even facing each other, but writing letters. That was a gray area, technically allowed under supervision, but realistically a whole covert system grew around it. Because where there are people stuck in boxes, there will always be someone who tries to pass a note. You glance around cell block A. Some inmates whisper to guards they've bribed with sweet biscuits, smuggled in laundry basket. Others offer carved trinkets, tiny whittled horses or spoons with initials, in exchange for just one posted letter. A few bolder types toss their crumpled notes out through bars during exercise hours, hoping a passerby might pick them up. It's absurd, it's touching. It's human. Historians still argue whether prison administrators truly didn't know or just chose to look the other way, charmed by the occasional heartsick scribble. One former prison chaplain even claimed in his journal that he secretly read every letter before forwarding it and tucked away the best ones for rainy nights. Unethical? Certainly, but at least someone appreciated the effort. The paper was often scavenged. Scraps from newspapers, pages torn from smuggled-in religious tracts, or occasionally the back of an official form requisitioning more soap. Ink? A wild mix of soot, boot polish, tea, and sometimes mashed berries if you were lucky enough to get dessert. The pen, usually a chewed twig, a rusty nail, or just a fingernail dipped and dragged. You kneel beside a cell where a man named Elijah has just finished a page. He folds it, carefully hides it behind a loose brick, and begins the next. His lover's name, Margaret, is written with such effort, you feel the paper tremble. He writes not about his punishment or the rats or the cold. Instead, he describes how he remembers the smell of her bread pudding and the way her hand felt in his before he was caught stealing a coat in the rain. It's not a particularly scandalous letter, but it's full of heart, and for someone with nothing, it's everything. Not all letters were romantic, of course. Some were desperate pleas for food, others tried to console wives left behind, or ask after children they might never see again. But even those often carried a warmth between the lines, a kind of trembling effort to remain more than just a prison. The British postal system, mind you, was shockingly efficient in those days. Penny stamps, red-coated postmen, and strict delivery routes. But inside prison walls, that's where the real creativity bloomed. Prisoners became their own couriers, hiding letters in hollow bed frames or behind chamber pots. And yes, one bold soul once tied a message to the tail of a passing cat. Whether the cat delivered it is still heartbreakingly unknown. There's a theory still debated by scholars that these letter-writing habits kept some prisoners sane, that the act of remembering love, or pretending it still existed, was enough to dull the edge of the days. Maybe that's why so many letters were never even sent. They were written, read aloud to a nearby rat, folded neatly, and kept under a pillow made of bundled rags. You take a breath and let the candle's glow fade around you. The stone cell is suddenly not just a cage. It's a space of memory, of aching hope, and of the softest rebellion. You shuffle quietly along the corridor, past barred doors and grated windows. The deeper you move into the prison, the more you begin to notice that letters weren't just tokens of affection. They were covert lifelines, and if you listened carefully through the stone, it was almost as if the walls themselves were whispering stories of how those messages escaped. Sending a letter from inside a Victorian prison wasn't as easy as scribbling and sealing. There were rules. Oh, so many rules. Officially, prisoners were only allowed to write home once every 3 months, and only if their behavior was spotless, and only under supervision, and only on pre-approved subjects. No wallowing in emotions, and absolutely no romantic rambling. Naturally, people found ways around this. You peer into a cell where a wiry man named Alfie is crouched over his bunk, mumbling softly to himself. He's not losing his mind. He's rehearsing. Every Thursday, the same guard passes by on laundry duty. Alfie has figured out that if he folds his shirt just right, he can slip a folded message into the lining without attracting attention. The guard's complicit, or just oblivious. Historians still argue whether guards were quietly bribed or blissfully clueless, but most agree that some level of casual smuggling was, let's say, tolerated. There were more dramatic methods too. One prisoner in Reading jail, famous mainly for housing Oscar Wilde, was caught lowering love notes out the window on a string made of knotted socks. Another daring inmate handed his letter to a visiting priest, who tucked it in his Bible and forgot it was there for 3 whole months. When he finally mailed it, the recipient thought it was a sign from heaven. Some prisoners wrote in code, using shared family slang, misspelled metaphors, or innocuous-seeming Bible passages. A line like "I have been reading Isaiah 55:12" might actually mean "I miss you, and I dream of you dancing." They turned scripture into seduction, and no one noticed. You slow down near a cell where a woman, unusual in these mostly male prisons, sits on the edge of her cot. Her name's Ada, convicted for pickpocketing on Oxford Street. In her lap is a tiny scrap of paper. She doesn't bother with laundry tricks or Bible codes. She's memorized the letter. She'll whisper it to her sister during visiting hour, and her sister will write it down and pass it along to the man Ada left behind. Old school dictation, prison edition. Not all guards were strict. Some were romantics at heart, passing notes without reporting them, especially if they were well-written or heart-wrenching. One such story involves a guard nicknamed Teacup Tom, who allegedly hand-delivered over 200 unsanctioned letters during his tenure. He was never punished, possibly because he delivered one of them to the warden's own niece. A few prisons even had their own black market delivery systems. Trusted inmates, often older, quieter types who worked in the infirmary or kitchens, acted as internal couriers. They moved between blocks, under the radar, shuttling folded scraps of affection, hidden in bread crusts or sewn into shirt cuffs. Payment, usually just the promise of protection or a piece of hard candy. In Victorian prison terms, that's luxury. There was risk, of course. If a letter was found during a surprise inspection, the punishment could be severe: loss of privileges, solitary confinement, confiscation of personal belongings, which often meant losing everything from worn blankets to cherished family photos. Yet they still wrote, often, repeatedly, and with an eloquence that would surprise anyone who thinks a prisoner can't be poetic. One surviving note, held now in a museum archive, simply reads, "Dearest, the pigeons flew lower today. I dreamt of your elbows again. Yours always, H." Historians are still baffled. Pigeons, elbows. Is it code, nonsense, or just the tender rambling of a man who's lost his grip on reality but clings fiercely to love? And this brings us to a key debate. Were these letters mostly romantic or mostly strategic? Some scholars argue they were just emotional manipulation, pleas for money, food parcels, or sympathy. Others say they were genuine, raw expressions of longing. The truth, as always, is probably both. Humans are complicated, even in chains. You pause at a mail slot bolted shut with rusted screws. At one time, it had been part of the official prison postal system. Letters were reviewed, censored, and sometimes rewritten entirely by staff to remove anything deemed improper. This included words like love, miss, or even what was left often sounded like a banking newsletter. "Dear Mother, I remain obedient. I am clean. The food is nutritious. Regards, Joseph." Of course, Joseph had likely written something more like, "I haven't tasted salt in 3 weeks. My heart itches for the please send socks and news of our tree." But the tree part, gone. Too emotional, too human. Which is why the real letters, the ones slipped through shadows, whispered into coat sleeves, or sewn into the lining of a visiting jacket, felt alive. They weren't meant to they were meant to connect, even if they never arrived. And even when they didn't, the writing itself gave purpose to the day. You lean against the wall and close your eyes for a moment. In a place designed to break spirits, something as soft as a paper heart still found a way to flutter between stone and steel. The first thing you notice when you enter the makeshift writing corner of cell block D is the smell. Not bad necessarily, just strangely earthy. A mix of damp stone, musty straw, and something almost metallic. You glance at the desk, which is really just a flat plank balanced on 2 overturned buckets. This is where the real artistry happened, not with brushes and canvas, but with soot, spit, and rags. Because if there's one thing Victorian prisoners learned fast, it was how to make do. They were barred from most comforts, but not from their imaginations. And when it came to letter writing, they got creative. You'd be amazed what counted as stationery in here. One man famously wrote 3 years of letters to his wife, using strips torn from his undergarments. That's love, and possibly a rash. Another inmate, known only as Red Jack, was so skilled at creating ink from fireplace ash and urine that his letters had an almost sepia-toned elegance. Disgusting? A little. Effective? Absolutely. Historians still study those letters for their chemical stability, which honestly sounds like the dullest chemistry thesis ever. But someone did it. Paper was rare. Really rare. Prisoners saved everything: tobacco wrappings, sugar bags, margins of smuggled-in hymnals. One group of women in a debtor's prison reportedly used flattened paper cups from the prison chapel's communion wine, an oddly holy medium for love letter. And if you think using tea as ink sounds improbable, remember, strong black tea stains everything it touches, including your teeth and the record of your deepest regrets. The tools were even more inventive. Lacking pens, prisoners used chicken bones sharpened against the wall, rusty nails, bits of wire, and on one memorable occasion, a sliver of coal tied to a matchstick. The goal wasn't beauty, it was legibility. Though, to be fair, some of the penmanship was stunning. Flowing cursive, unnecessary flourishes, loops so wide they looked like calligraphy from a Gothic fairy tale. There was even competition, unofficial of course, who had the nicest script, whose letters got the most replies, whose metaphors made grown men weep into their soup. This wasn't just writing, it was the one form of self-expression, allowed in a world that stripped away names, clothes, and dignity. Take a step into the records of Millbank Prison, and you'll find an entry describing a confiscated letter, written in purple dye, made from crushed beet skin. It had been smuggled in via a pie. No, not inside a pie, under the crust, tucked between layers of cabbage and minced meat. Who does that? Someone in love, that's who. And yet, prison authorities still tried to suppress it. In official documentation, they labeled these acts as contraband sentimentality, which is probably the coldest phrase you'll hear all night. Historians still argue whether wardens truly feared emotional corruption, or if they were just annoyed by all the ink stains on their ledger. Then there were prisoners who became designated scribes. Not everyone could write, especially among poorer inmates, so the few who could became the emotional middlemen. For a small fee, a heel of bread, a spoonful of jam, they'd write someone else's word. Imagine that. Whispering your heart's secrets to a stranger with a smuggled nail-dipped stick, hoping they didn't misspell your beloved's name. These scribe letters had a style all their own. You could spot them by the overuse of flourishes, and phrases like "your most obedient suitor," or "my soul languishes in the shadow of your absence." Flowery, definitely, but the sentiment often rang true. Even hardened inmates wept reading those borrowed words. You pause beside a row of bunk beds, the wooden frames carved with initials and odd notches. A few prisoners kept secret inkwells, tiny cups fashioned from hollowed buttons or the carved-out base of a soap bar. The ink often had to be remixed daily, depending on the weather. Too humid, the tea got moldy. Too cold, the soot clumped. But despite these obstacles, letters flowed, like tributaries of forgotten rivers. They found ways to move, and sometimes they were intercepted. A warden in 1872 once published a list of forbidden letter topics, which included politics, religion, escape plans, and most heartbreakingly dreams. Just that. Dreams. Too dangerous, apparently. Can't have people dreaming when they're supposed to be broken. It didn't stop anyone. If anything, it made the dreams louder. One prisoner wrote a series of poems to his wife, all disguised as shopping lists. 2 tins of plum, he wrote, 1 loaf of rye, 3 kisses for breakfast. It passed the censor. The warden underlined rye and wrote no substitution. Meanwhile, some guards read the letters aloud to one another after hours, laughing at the romantic melodrama. Others, touched by the sincerity, quietly mailed the messages themselves, never recording it. Still others confiscated them with a bored sigh and a muttered, "Not this again." The deeper question remains, were these letters a form of rebellion, or just a coping mechanism? Historians still can't agree. Some say prisoners used romance as resistance, a way to retain identity in a system designed to erase them. Others believe it was simply a way to pass the time, like playing chess with breadcrumbs, or giving yourself a prison tattoo made from soot and sewing needles. You glance back at the writing corner and see someone placing a finished letter under the straw mattress, eyes darting, heart racing. It'll wait there until the laundry run, or until a sympathetic trustee swings by, or until visiting hours, or maybe it'll never leave. But it was written, and sometimes that's enough. You make your way past a corridor of peeling paint, and the low murmur of a distant snore, stopping just outside cell block C, where the walls are heavier with stories than with mortar. If this prison were a novel, cell block C would be the dog-eared chapter, always reread. It's here that one of the most peculiar and most touching cases of prisoner correspondence unfolded. A man named Thomas Everley occupied the 3rd cell from the end. Convicted for forging railway bonds, he wasn't violent, but he wasn't exactly trustworthy either. And yet, over the course of 6 years, he wrote precisely 23 letters to a woman named Edith Morrow. Edith, for her part, lived above a shoe shop in Camden and had only met Thomas twice before he was arrested. Twice. They had shared tea and he had complimented her sewing. That was it. But apparently, something about the rhythm of her silence and the particular way she stirred her cup stuck with him. So once locked up, he began writing. Every Monday, without fail. The first few letters were stiff, observational. A weather report wrapped in regret. Dear Miss Morrow, today I observed a spider descending from the ceiling. It reminded me of the fragility of structure. Also, I hope you are well. But the tone shifted quickly. By letter 12, he was asking how her father's gout was doing. By letter 30, he was describing a dream he had where she was wearing a red scarf and holding a small, bossy dog named Albert. There was no dog, but there might as well have been. Edith didn't respond, not at first, for months, maybe even a year. Her silence was total. And still, Thomas wrote, using boot polish and diluted tea, with stolen paper and a borrowed pen stub. He wrote. Then one day, a reply arrived. No one saw it happen. No one remembered passing it along. But suddenly, Thomas had a small cream-colored envelope. Tucked under his bread plate inside was a note. I don't know why I'm writing back, but I liked the story about the spider. And just like that, a correspondence began. Weekly, then bi-weekly, then irregular but steady, like a heartbeat with its own tempo. They never exchanged photographs. That was forbidden. But Thomas sent Edith a pressed wildflower he found growing between the prison stones. Wrapped in a tissue he'd folded into a heart. She mailed him a page torn from her old school reader, a poem about robins in winter. It wasn't grand, it wasn't torrid, but it was real. Other prisoners noticed. Soon Thomas became something of a block celebrity. The scribe of Cell C, they called him, half in jest, half in envy. He once wrote a limerick for another inmate to give to his sweetheart. And though the rhyme scheme was questionable, the gesture earned him a slice of bacon from someone's Sunday stash. Historians still debate the motivations behind their exchange. Was it love? Loneliness? Performance? Some scholars argue that Edith saw herself as part of a moral experiment, a test in empathy. Others believe she genuinely grew fond of the strange, poetic man behind bars. And maybe she did. In one letter she wrote, I have no use for poetry, Thomas, but I find myself waiting for Mondays. They never married. When Thomas was released, he reportedly walked to the shoe shop on Camden High Street, but it had closed a year earlier. Edith had moved, leaving no address. All he had left were her letters and a shoehorn she'd once mailed him as a joke. He kept them in a wooden box until he died. That box was eventually discovered by a distant niece, who sold its contents to a collector of prison ephemera. Some of the letters are now archived at a small museum in Dorset, under the title The Spider and the Shoehorn, which honestly sounds like the slowest-selling romance novel ever written, but also maybe the sweetest. You sit down beside Thomas's old cell, imagining his boots scraping against the stone, his hand shaking slightly as he dipped his makeshift pen into a chipped cup of tea. There's something unhurried about the way he would have written, as if each letter gave the day its structure, its breath. In a world where time dragged, the next envelope gave it shape. And what of Edith? Did she cry at his last letter? Did she mean to leave no trace? Was the missing address an accident or mercy? Historians, as you might guess, still argue about that too. But the story endures, and not just because it's quaint or tragic, or uniquely Victorian. It endures because it captures something universal. The human impulse to reach out, across concrete and silence, with nothing more than words and hope. You shift slightly, feeling the cold stone beneath you. All around you, the walls seem to hum with the ghosts of unfinished sentences and letters never sent. And somewhere out there, maybe, someone still waits for Monday. You find yourself staring at a wall, plain, gray, and cracked until your eyes catch something faint. A drawing. Just a scribble, really. It looks like a bird, maybe a pigeon wearing a crown. It's hard to tell. But you smile, because this isn't just idle graffiti. It's a message, or rather, it was one. A hidden note, a clever disguise, a coded kiss, sent from one lonely heart to another, under the noses of the ever-watchful guards. Because in the world of Victorian prisoners, where every word was scrutinized, and every emotion had to pass through a filter of bureaucracy, writing what you actually felt was a dangerous luxury, so they adapted. They got clever. They used code. Take a common phrase like, "I hope you are warm." It seems innocent enough. But inside it might carry layers of hidden meaning. Warm meant loved. Cold meant forgotten. A reference to the kettle might mean I still burn for you. And if someone mentioned buttons, well, that usually meant longing, though to be honest, no one's sure why. Possibly because unbuttoning was the closest one could get to seduction in a censored world. One woman imprisoned for fraud in 1879 signed every letter with a little drawing of a daisy. At first glance, just a flower. But she had once told her lover, "If I send a daisy, it means I remember your scent." That symbol became their entire shared world. She once drew it in soap on her prison window, just so she could watch the sunlight pass through it. Historians still argue whether these codes were improvised individually or part of a secret prisoner culture. Were they personal symbols, or passed quietly cell to cell like folk songs, growing new meanings with each retelling? You step past a group of bunk beds and see a folded square of paper wedged behind a beam. It's old, crisp, brown at the edges, and nearly impossible to read, but you can still make out a doodle of a small dog chasing a ribbon. In a later commentary, the recipient confessed this meant, "I missed the scent of your hair as it trailed behind you." Again, not something you'd want the warden to read. But in code, just canine hijinks. There were entire alphabets made up of ink dots and lines, hidden in the margins of letters. A few prisoners even used chess notation. Pawn to e4 wasn't about strategy. It meant you are the first move I think of every morning. And yes, it's cheesy, but remember, when you're surrounded by stone and shame, even cheesy becomes sacred. One man developed an elaborate set of bird metaphors. The sparrow lands early meant he'd received her letter. The hawk circles but does not dive meant the guards were suspicious. The owl waits in silence meant, well, it probably meant he was sulking, but it sounds cooler in bird speak. A handful of surviving letters even show signs of disappearing ink, lemon juice or milk, later revealed with heat. One particularly bold soul mailed his sweetheart a blank sheet and instructed her to hold it above a candle. The message read, "The darkness here is nothing compared to what I feel when I think you've forgotten me." Very dramatic, possibly dangerous, undeniably romantic. You can almost hear the whisper of that page catching fire just a bit too much. Some lovers used poetry as a smokescreen. The rhymes were clunky, the meter inconsistent, but between the lines were entire dictionaries of emotion. One inmate wrote, "The moon is round, the night is cold, my cell is still, my stew is old. Yet through the bars a breeze I feel, and dream that you, my heart, are real." Not exactly Wordsworth, but it got the job done. Even more subtle were letters that used the absence of meaning as meaning. Entire sections left blank, or lines skipped deliberately, each gap a pause, a breath, a space for the recipient to insert their own longing. Think of it as the Victorian prisoner version of a text that just says, "Hey," followed by nothing. Infuriating, effective, and sometimes prisoners drew maps, not of escape plans but of memories. One man drew a rough diagram of the village green where he met his wife. Another outlined the floor plan of their old flat, complete with the squeaky stair and the cupboard where they hid sugar cubes. He labeled it all. Window where you once cried. Table we didn't like but used anyway. It's enough to make your throat tight. You crouch beside an old cell door and run your fingers over a set of faint carvings, numbers, letters, a strange little star. Was it a secret message, a quiet act of defiance, a love note etched into the very bones of the prison itself? Historians still debate how many of these codes were ever understood. After all, a message means little if the recipient doesn't know the key. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe just trying to communicate, just scratching out some version of love in whatever form was enough. Because at the end of the day, a letter with a silly dog drawing, or a half-faded daisy, or a poem that rhymes cold with mold, still meant one vital thing. I remember you. And in a place designed to make you disappear, being remembered is everything. You lean against a cold stone pillar, watching as two prisoners shuffle past with a bucket of mop water and a half-hearted sense of urgency. No one's in a rush here. After all, what is time when every hour tastes the same? Except, oddly enough, not every prisoner was trying to break the rules when it came to letter writing. Believe it or not, some letters were actually allowed, sanctioned, even encouraged under certain strict conditions, of course. Welcome to the confusing world of warden-approved affections. In Victorian England, reform was a buzzword among prison administrators. Many believed that allowing prisoners to maintain a thread of connection to the outside world, particularly to family, might help reform their soul, but only if done properly. And by properly, they meant excruciatingly boring. No, I miss you. No thinking of your smile. Just I am well, my work is assigned. I have not sinned. You can imagine how thrilled everyone was to write that once every 3 months under the warden's watchful eye. So how did it work? Well, inmates could apply to send or receive a letter on the condition that it was inspected, sometimes copied word for word by a prison clerk, and only sent if it passed moral scrutiny, meaning it couldn't contain inflammatory language, complaints about prison conditions, or, as one warden put it, excessive sentiment, which is to say, no poems, no longing, and absolutely no kissing, described in any fashion, real or metaphorical. The official tone was stifling. You'd get things like, "Dear Mary, I remain your husband. I am eating porridge daily. My boots have held up. God be with you." And on the receiving end, "Dear Harold, the cow is dry. I made soup. Agnes says hello. Do not disgrace us." So technically, these letters were affectionate, in the way that a government form can be affectionate. Still, some prisoners played the game beautifully. They developed ways to sneak emotion into the cracks. A misplaced comma here, a double-meaning phrase there. One man signed every letter with "Your constant observer," which was technically neutral but somehow deeply unsettling and romantic at the same time. Another simply wrote, "I remember Sunday," and let that line do all the heavy lifting. Historians still argue whether wardens actually understood these subtle subversions and let them slide, or whether they were simply too bored to care. Some former prison staff, writing in retirement journals, confessed that they let a few extra letters through if they were particularly well written. One even claimed he mailed a whole stack of unsanctioned love notes from his personal postbox because it was Valentine's Day, and what else could I do? And get this, in rare cases, especially with model prisoners, wardens encouraged correspondence with wives or fiancés. There are records of administrators writing things like, "Prisoner X may benefit from marital stabilization upon release. Permission granted for communication if kept moral," which is possibly the least sexy endorsement of love ever written. This policy led to some of the strangest love letters in history. Take the case of George and Eliza Banning. George, imprisoned for stealing barrels of rum, was granted one supervised letter per quarter. Eliza, a fiery-minded schoolteacher, responded to every letter by inserting appropriate verses from the Bible. But between the lines, she developed a code, starting her letters with increasingly obscure psalms that referenced passion, longing, or reunion. George, realizing what she was doing, mirrored the tone. His next letter opened with, "My conduct has been improved by recent reflection on If you're unfamiliar, Proverbs 5 is mostly about the dangers of adultery. And strangely, about drinking from your own cistern, which made the prison chaplain blush when he reviewed it. Eventually, the staff stopped checking their letters. Perhaps they grew tired of parsing metaphor. Perhaps they saw what everyone else did, that this stilted, scripture-wrapped romance was doing more good than harm. Because here's the unexpected truth. Some of these warden-approved letters did help people stay sane. The act of writing, even within strict guidelines, gave shape to days that otherwise blurred into nothing. And for the loved ones on the outside, receiving a folded page that said nothing but "I am upright and clean" was paradoxically a lifeline. In one particularly wholesome case, a woman named Martha compiled all her husband's prison letters, dozens of pages of weather reports and meal descriptions, and had them bound in leather after his release. She titled it "The Quiet Day." It now sits quietly in a tiny regional museum in Kent. But not everyone played by the rules. Some letters were written according to prison standards on the outside, but inside, between the margins, invisible ink would tell a completely different story. Romantic, silly, sometimes scandalous. One couple even sent a recipe for beef stew that line by line described their wedding night. To anyone else, it was just culinary nostalgia. You glance down at a reproduction of one such letter, neatly folded, edges singed with time. It reads, "The flour must be stirred slowly. 2 cups of warmth, a spoonful of memory. Simmer until the heart softens." The prison clerk underlined the word flour, added a note, possibly code for contraband, and approved it anyway. What remains so strange and touching about these letters is how ordinary they tried to sound, as though by pretending everything was normal, by writing about weather and boiled potatoes and laundry mishaps, prisoners could stitch themselves back into the fabric of life. And sometimes they succeeded. Understand the whisk until weary, and serve with an apology for existing. Don't scream culinary brilliance, but they do speak volumes about how Beatrice felt. Some letters were sapphic, openly, or coded. The Victorian world officially didn't acknowledge such relationship, but prison was its own universe. In close quarters, affection often bloomed where it was least expected. There's a note from 1883 that begins, "To my dearest Hannah, when they searched my cell they didn't find your name carved beneath my cot, but it is there, and it is there. You kneel beside that exact bunk, the name still faintly visible. Hannah, carved with a button or a spoon, carefully, as though every stroke was a secret exhale." You can't help but admire the resourcefulness of these women. They embroidered love notes into handkerchiefs. They baked messages into biscuits. One even tied a ribbon around her wrist and said, "This is my sentence. Every time I take it off, I think of her." Somehow that ribbon made it into the visitors' waiting room. No one knows how, but it was. Prison officials were often more suspicious of women's letters, especially if they veered from the expected tone of repentance and submission. A warden once remarked, "Female prisoners, when permitted to write, do so with excessive flamboyance. One might say, passion. Yet even under surveillance, the voices pushed through." There's an account of a woman in Newgate who refused to write a standard "I am sorry" letter, and instead sent her lover a drawing of a bee chasing a cup of tea. When asked to explain, she said, "Because I'm buzzing, and she's steeped in my thoughts." The guards confiscated it, but she drew it again, and again, and again. Historians still debate whether these women were consciously resisting social norms, or simply reaching out the only way they could. But what's undeniable is the clarity of their voices. These were not passive victims of fate. They were witty, stubborn, poetic, and often wildly funny. One letter ends with, "P.S. They say I'm to be released in April. I've decided not to go, unless you meet me with jam and that look you gave me on the ferry. Otherwise, I'll riot. Lovingly, N. That letter is now housed in a climate-controlled case at the British Library. It smells faintly of lavender and ink. You look around the quiet women's wing. There's a calm here, but not because of submission. It's the calm of knowing your words have reached someone, somewhere, that even in this place of shame and silence, your voice has carried, and that's all love really wants, isn't it? A place to land. You round a bend in the hallway and enter a much quieter wing of the prison. Here, the air feels different, less charged, more still. The iron bars seem gentler, the footsteps fewer. This is the women's block. Victorian society didn't like to talk about women prisoners. They were seen as doubly shameful. Not only had they committed crimes, but they'd also failed at being proper women. And yet, behind these locked doors, stories bloomed, just as poetic, just as romantic, and often far more cutting than anything written on the men's side. Tonight, you're stepping into their world. You stop beside a door marked only with a scratched heart, and the letters LR. Inside, Louisa Ray is seated on her bunk, cross-legged, surrounded by pages. She's not just writing letters, she's crafting miniature novels. Her sentences wind and dance, and sometimes jab. Her wit is sharp. If Thomas Everley was all wistful longing, Louisa writes like she's inviting you into a duel, one where the winner gets kissed. Louisa had been a milliner before prison, making hats, and as the record euphemistically puts it, socializing with her clients beyond retail hours. She knew words, and she knew how to use them. One of her surviving letters to a man named Charlie begins, "I'm told I must not be affectionate, so I will be precise. My dreams are 34 seconds longer when I think of your nose. Yesterday I slapped a fly and named it after your landlady. That is all. Romantic, questionable, memorable, undeniably." Historians still debate how many women prisoners were permitted to send letters at all. Official records are sparse and often dismissive, but scraps survive. And from those fragments you can sense that many women were not only writing, they were rewriting the terms of love entirely. One particularly famous example, Edith Langford, jailed for setting fire to her employer's outhouse. On Story, sent a series of letters to her childhood friend Maria. Over 3 years, the tone shifts, tentative to playful, playful to poetic, poetic to fiercely protective. "You once told me," she writes, "that no one would write a song for you, so I've decided to send you one, line by line until I'm out." She made it to verse 27. Maria kept every page. There's a quiet rebellion in these letters. Many women refused to play the repentant angel role expected of them. They didn't just beg forgiveness or yearn for husbands. They gossiped. They joked. They gave it. They remembered what their lover smelled like after the rain and noted which books were banned this week. And they did it all on scraps of laundry lists, stolen hymnals, or the blank backs of prison inventory. You stoop to look at a page smuggled out of Holloway Prison, where a woman named Beatrice wrote a recipe for pudding, except the instructions make no sense unless you understand the subtext. Whisk until weary and serve with an apology for existing. Don't scream culinary brilliant, but they do speak volumes about how Beatrice felt. Some letters were sapphic, openly or coded. The Victorian world officially didn't acknowledge such relationships, but prison was its own universe. In close quarters, affection often bloomed where it was least expected. There's a note from 1883 that begins, "To my dearest Hannah, when they searched my cell, they didn't find your name carved beneath my cot. But it is there, and it is there. You kneel beside that exact bunk, the name still faintly visible. Hannah, carved with a button or a spoon, carefully, as though every stroke was a secret exhale." You can't help but admire the resourcefulness of these women. They embroidered love notes into handkerchiefs. They baked messages into biscuits. One even tied a ribbon around her wrist and said, "This is my scent. Every time I take it off, I think of her." Somehow that ribbon made it into the visitors' waiting room. No one knows how, but it was there. Prison officials were often more suspicious of women's letters, especially if they veered from the expected tone of repentance and submission. A warden once remarked, "Female prisoners, when permitted to write, do so with excessive flamboyance. One might say, passion, yet even under surveillance, the voices pushed." There's an account of a woman in Newgate who refused to write a standard "I am sorry" letter, and instead sent her lover a drawing of a bee chasing a cup of tea. When asked to explain, she said, "Because I'm buzzing and she's steeped in my thoughts." The guards confiscated, but she drew it again, and again, and again. Historians still debate whether these women were consciously resisting social norms, or simply reaching out the only way they could. But what's undeniable is the clarity of their voices. These were not passive victims of fate. They were witty, stubborn, poetic, and often wildly funny. One letter ends with "P.S. They say I'm to be released in April. I've decided not to go unless you meet me with jam and that look you gave me on the ferry. Otherwise I'll riot. Loving." That letter is now housed in a climate-controlled case at the British Library. It smells faintly of lavender and ink. You look around the quiet women's wing. There's a calm here, but not because of submission. It's the calm of knowing your words have reached someone somewhere, that even in this place of shame and silence, your voice has carried, and that's all love really wants, isn't it? A place to land. You follow the corridor back toward the main hall, the low hum of distant voices giving way to a new sound, faint laughter. Not the wild kind, but soft, rolling chuckles, as if someone just reread a particularly absurd sentence for the third time and still couldn't get over it. You follow the noise to a cell where 3 prisoners are gathered around a single sheet of paper. One of them is holding it aloft like it's a treasure map. He's reading aloud, slowly, dramatically, savoring every syllable. "And if the stew improves, tell my cousin, for he still owes me the debt of a good onion." Laughter. A slap to the shoulder. Someone says, "He's got away with words, I'll give him that." This, believe it or not, was a common sight. Welcome to the surprisingly theatrical tradition of public readings of private love letters. Yes, in a place as bleak and restrained as a Victorian prison, the act of reading your letter aloud to others on purpose became a form of status, survival, and sometimes much-needed comedy. See, mail was precious. Most prisoners never received a letter, so when someone did, it was both a moment of envy and communal curiosity. What did she say? Was it poetic? Was it spicy? Did she mention your bunions again? Sometimes, the letters were simply too good not to share. You might assume it was embarrassing to read a love note in front of a dozen other men, but it wasn't always that way. In fact, it was often a moment of power. Imagine being the guy whose sweetheart wrote in perfect cursive, with metaphors that made grown men sigh and mutter, "Blimey, that's good." For one fleeting moment, you weren't just prisoner in fort. You were the guy who got the letter with the metaphor about the rain and the toast. One well-documented case involves a prisoner named Percy, known for reading his fiancée's letters aloud in the yard, complete with voices and dramatic hand gesture. He once delivered a passage describing her yearning arms, so vividly that another inmate burst into tears and then punched a wall to save face. Historians still argue whether these performances were acts of vulnerability or defense. Was Percy trying to keep the romance alive or just ward off loneliness with theatrical flair? Some inmates even took to writing fictional letters just to read them aloud. Think about that. Writing imaginary love letters to pretend someone missed you, then sharing them as if they were real. It's tragic, brilliant, and undeniably human. One man reportedly recited the same letter every Thursday for months. Only when someone pointed out the ink never changed did he confess, "Ain't about the ink, it's the memory Of course, not every reading was sincere. Sometimes it was bravado, the prisoner equivalent of flexing. Look what she said to me. You might hear lines like, she says I'm her lion in a cage, to which another would quip, tell her you're more like a sleepy tabby mate. Other times, it was just entertainment. These readings became a kind of nightly ritual in certain blocks. A single letter could spark debates over meaning. Did I miss the smell of your coat? Mean love? Or just hygiene concerns? Even the guards got involved. One former warden wrote in his memoir that he'd pause outside cell block F on Friday nights just to hear the prison poets perform. He claimed it was better than most local theater and far cheaper. There's even evidence of letters being rewritten by group consensus. A man would read his draft aloud, and others would shout corrections. No, don't say I miss your feet. That's creepy. Say your footsteps. Add something about stars. Women love stars. Mention pie. Always mention pie. And so a rough draft became a collaboration, a collective expression of longing, polished like a shared tool passed from calloused hand to calloused hand. This communal editing wasn't limited to men. Records from women's prisons suggest similar rituals, though with a bit more secret. Whispered critiques passed during laundry, or coded compliments scratched into soap bars. One inmate described it as writing in chorus, but with one solo voice. You pass by an old laundry cart that once carried these edited pages between cells. Its wheels still squeak, probably always did. Inside, someone has carved into the wood. Better a sentence from her than a lifetime from them. The phrase "a sentence" is doing double duty there. Classic prison humor. Not all group readings were kind. Some letters were mocked. A poorly written metaphor could follow a man for weeks. My heart is like your old wool coat, full of holes, but warm. It doesn't hit quite right, does it? He meant well. But the teasing was relentless. Still, most prisoners respected the bravery it took to share, because to read a letter aloud, to let others hear how much you missed someone, how small you felt, without them was an act of courage. It reminded everyone that no matter how long the sentence, love was still a possibility. Historians still debate whether these readings were therapeutic or performative, perhaps both. But in a place where individuality was stripped away, reading your lover's words aloud, hearing laughter, sighs, and even applause, that was something close to being seen. You stand now in the center of a cell, where echoes still linger. It's quiet, but if you close your eyes, you can almost hear a man clearing his throat, unfolding a crumpled sheet, and saying, "This next bit's about her smile, and her and for a few precious minutes, even behind bars, love becomes a shared event." You drift now into the heart of the cell block, canteen, long deserted, save for benches worn by time and conversations. There's a corner table where prisoners once gathered to play dominoes with mismatched tiles, to swap stories about their cases, and perhaps most importantly, to trade letters. Yes, tonight you're entering the peculiar underground economy where love letters became currency. In a place with almost no material possessions, everything holds potential value. A pencil nub could get you half a biscuit. A good joke might earn you an extra scoop of watery stew. But a love letter? A real handwritten, tear-stained love letter from someone on the outside? That was gold. You sit down and run your hand along the edge of the table where someone long ago carved a heart with the initials S. You wonder if the letter they traded for that carving ever made it to its destination, or if it was passed, bartered, rewritten, and sold 3 cells down in exchange for a pair of clean socks and half a roll of tobacco. Letters were alive in this economy not just as symbols of affection, but as tools of negotiation, influence, and sometimes deception. Let's say you received a letter from your beloved. You could treasure it, sure. Keep it under your pillow. Read it over and over until the corners curled and the ink smudged. Or you could loan it. One inmate might ask, "Could I borrow that letter, just for tonight? I'll give it back tomorrow with a crust of bread." You'd be surprised how many said yes, because reading a love letter Even one addressed to someone else could be a balm, a moment of escape. And sometimes people weren't borrowing it to read. They were borrowing it to pretend it was theirs. Just for a few minutes. Just to imagine that someone out there was waiting for them to. There's a story from Wandsworth Prison about a man nicknamed the Librarian, who collected over 30 love letters, some real, some forged, and rented them out in exchange for small favors. You could choose from categories: longing, apology, mildly flirtatious, or extremely poetic if slightly unhinged. He even offered rewrites for an extra lump of sugar. Historians still debate the ethics of this practice. Was it exploitative? Therapeutic? A bit of both. Some prisoners forged letters entirely. They'd copy phrases from books, twist the details, and invent fictional wives, sweethearts, even children. One man was caught mailing letters to himself using a friend's sister's address, just so he could have something to read aloud on Sunday. When confronted, he reportedly said, "It's no crime to want to feel missed." The barter system didn't stop at lending. Whole letters were traded for food, warm clothes, or the right to sit by the warm pipe during winter night. If your cellmate had a particularly eloquent sweetheart, someone who described snowfall or sent pressed flowers, you might trade your entire dinner ration for just one page. Some prisoners got savvy. They'd embellish their own letters to increase trade value. Add a stanza of bad poetry here, throw in a dried petal glued to the corner. Suddenly your average "I miss you" letter became deluxe content. The more emotional it was, the more valuable it became. In female prisons, the trade took on a slightly different flavor. Many women exchanged letters as emotional currency, offering support, validation, or affection in exchange for small comforts. "If you let me read your letter, I'll tell you about the dream I had last night. If you lend me your ink, I'll let you use my memory of my husband's handwriting." It sounds strange, but in a place designed to erase individuality, these letters became identity. They were proof of an outside world, of memory, of selfhood. And trading them wasn't always about profit. Sometimes it was about sharing humanity. Not all barters were fair. One man famously tricked another into trading a real letter for what turned out to be a recipe for plum pudding, disguised as verse. It read beautifully: "Stir the silence with cinnamon, fold grief into flour, and bake at midnight until no longer bitter." Poetic? Yes. Honest? Not quite. There were other creative transactions. One inmate offered to write custom letters for those who had none, essentially ghostwriting romance. For a price, he'd invent a sweetheart, write 3 letters, and even advise on emotional replies. He'd never met the person he was pretending to be. Still, the recipient would clutch those pages like treasure. You glanced toward the back of the canteen where a notice board still hung. Once upon a time, prisoners pinned announcements there. Laundry schedules, poetry contests, and on rare occasions, anonymous messages. One yellowing scrap read, "To the gentleman who received a letter last Wednesday with the word lantern in it, I envy you. Tell her she writes like velvet." Some say letters were even wagered in games, chess, cards, dice. One lost letter passed down in legend was won during a game of dominoes and inspired an impromptu poem recital. The loser wept, not because of the game, but because it was the only page his wife had ever sent. Historians often debate whether this trading devalued the meaning of the letters. Did bartering your emotions cheapen them? But maybe that's the wrong question, because what these trades reveal is that love, real, imagined, borrowed, had value. Emotional weight became a form of currency, more powerful than bread or blankets. And maybe that's not devaluation. Maybe that's elevation. You stand up from the bench and feel the table shiver faintly beneath your hand, as if remembering the dozens of deals brokered over its surface. Letters, poems, promises, all moving between hands, folded and unfolded, smoothed flat and read by moonlight. In this place of scarcity, love wasn't just something you felt, it was something you shared. You ease open a door that leads into a quieter wing, a block reserved for prisoners awaiting transfer, sentencing, or, in some cases, appeal. It feels heavier here, Not because the air is stale, though it is, but because every breath seems to hold the weight of unfinished stories. And sometimes, those stories end up in courtrooms, because while love letters were meant to be private, folded close to the heart, more than a few ended up in very public places on the witness stand. Read aloud under oath, their romantic prose suddenly transformed into evidence. Imagine that your most vulnerable, poetic, slightly overdramatic scribble now being dissected by a barrister in full wig and robe. One of the earliest recorded examples involved a prisoner named Alfred Brantley, whose letters to a local seamstress named Clara were intercepted during a surprise cell search. What began as a routine confiscation became a legal headache when Clara's father used the letters in a civil suit, claiming Alfred had corrupted her virtue. The letters weren't lewd. In fact, they were filled with rambling metaphors about teacups, frost, and Clara's eyebrows, but in court, they were read aloud as evidence of improper intentions. The courtroom transcript includes the following line, delivered by a very serious judge. The accused describes the young woman's silence as thick with perfume. Is this a metaphor for restraint or seduction? Historians still laugh at that one, but it wasn't always funny. Some letters were used as confessions, unintended ones. A prisoner might write, "I'd do it all again just to feel your arms that night," not realizing that it would be interpreted in court as a clear admission of guilt. You pass a cell where once a man named Darius Holloway wrote weekly to his sweetheart, always ending his letters with the phrase, "For the fire we lit together." Romantic, certainly, but when Darius was later implicated in an arson case, those very letters were pulled from evidence and cited as motive. A defense lawyer tried to argue that fire was metaphorical. The prosecution brought in a literary expert to debate the symbolic versus literal use of flame. That trial lasted 7 days. Darius wept when the jury read the verdict, not for the conviction, but because his last letter had been misquoted in court. There are even cases where love letters serve to convict someone else. One woman, Elizabeth Fenn, was accused of assisting in a prison escape in 8. The case hinged on a letter she had received from her lover inside. In it, he'd drawn a crude map with a little heart next to the back gate, and written, "You're the key." It was meant to be sweet. Instead, it was interpreted as a literal plan, and she spent 2 years behind bars for conspiracy. Historians still debate whether courts should have used private letters this way. Were they fair game? Did the passion of the writer cloud the legal judgment of the reader, or was it simply another example of how anything written, however heartfelt, can be weaponized under the wrong light? The letters weren't always damning. Sometimes they saved lives. Take the case of Samuel Travers, a printer by trade, imprisoned for assault. During his trial, a letter from his wife was submitted as a character reference. She described him not in legal terms, but in tiny domestic images, how he tucked in their son, how he whistled while chopping carrot. The judge, moved by her steady, unflowery words, reduced Samuel's sentence by 6 months. In another instance, a woman's love letter proved she had been elsewhere on the night of the crime. She described in painstaking detail what her fiancé had worn to dinner. The green waistcoat you insisted was teal, the one with the moth-eaten corner I pretend not to see. It matched a tavern account, down to the threadbare buttons. Of course, there were the accidental reveals. One prisoner wrote to 2 different lovers on alternating Sundays, unaware that their letters would be cross-examined when both women submitted character statements on his behalf. The phrase, "You are the moonlight that keeps me sane," appeared in both, copied word for word. The judge raised an eyebrow. One woman stormed out. The other testified anyway. The man, according to notes, looked distinctly uncomfortable. You pause outside a wooden evidence locker. Inside, filed with faded tags, are dozens of confiscated letters that never made it home. Some have brown wax seals, others smudged initials, a few tied with twine. Each one is frozen in time, still carrying the weight of secrets, intentions, or misguided metaphors. And somewhere in a dusty archive is the story of the peppermint letter, a page spritzed with something meant to resemble cologne. It was sniffed in court by a magistrate, who ruled it distracting and banned it from evidence. The scent lingered in the courtroom for days, forever remembered, as the trial of the sweetheart scent. You can't help but reflect on how something so intimate, so earnestly written by candlelight on scraps of stolen paper, could one day be picked apart under gaslight in front of strangers. But maybe that's the risk of putting love into words. Once it's written, it's no longer just yours. And yet, they kept writing. Even knowing a letter might end up in court, even knowing it might be read by a judge, a jury, or a parent with a they still dipped sticks in soot, scribbled metaphors, and folded hearts into corners, because expressing love, even at risk, is still better than letting it wither in silence. You walk on, past the cold brick and iron, and wonder how many verdicts were softened or hardened by a single turn of phrase, a remembered scent, a shaky signature. The courtroom may have belonged to the judge, but the letter always belonged to the heart that wrote it. You wander now toward the prison's old archive room, a dusty little annex, where moldy ledgers, confiscated items, and forgotten spectacles once lived in shaky filing cabinets. You push open a creaking door and breathe in the scent of parchment, iron, and time, because tonight's stop is not just in the courtroom or cell block, but in the pages of Victorian tabloids, where prisoner love letters occasionally went viral, 19th century style. You wouldn't think Victorian society, so prim, so corseted, so politely outraged, would have any appetite for the romantic musings of convicts. But oh, how wrong you'd be. Picture it, a headline in a London penny paper reading, "Criminal Correspondence, a most amorous note from the go." Beneath it, a full paragraph quoting a prisoner's letter to his ladybird, describing how her laughter sounds like cherries shaken in a tin. The editor adds, smugly, "We doubt the sound, but admire the sentiment." It wasn't exactly Pulitzer material, but people loved it. These letters would leak in all sorts of ways, through guards with loose lips, court trials that became public record, or even spurned lovers who sent them to editors out of spite. One newspaper proudly printed a letter that began, "My darling Blossom, prison gruel reminds me of your sad porridge, and I yearn for both." Within days, someone had written in to complain, "His comparison is unjust. My porridge is quite fine, sir." Historians still argue whether newspapers published these letters to mock, scandalize, or secretly romanticize. But the truth probably lies in a combination of curiosity, schadenfreude, and a deep Victorian need to peek behind every curtain, even iron ones. You might wonder why a prisoner's private words would be treated like entertainment. But in an age before television, before TikToks and podcasts, the written word was both weapon and window, and nothing sold better than a whiff of scandal sprinkled with just enough sentiment to excuse the purchase. There's even evidence of certain newspapers paying for letters. A reporter from the London Mercury allegedly bribed a young kitchen boy at Pentonville to fish notes from the waste bin. He found one half-burned letter that read, "If ever I see the sea again, I shall name each wave after your freckles." The boy reportedly asked for a raise. He didn't get it. You move deeper into the archive, past boxes labeled unclaimed property and to be burned. One open folder contains newspaper clippings from headlines include, "Criminally yours, a love letter from the gallows, Galhouse Juliet writes again, the heart behind bars, a felon's valentine." Each is printed with cheeky commentary, sometimes admiring, sometimes. A reader favorite involved a woman writing to her sweetheart about the scent of lavender soap, only for the editor to add, "We hope the prison laundry takes note." Not everyone approved. Letters sparked debates. Was this voyeurism, moral collapse, an affront to good taste? Religious groups protested. Parliamentarians scoffed. One bishop even declared that publishing prisoner letters romanticized wickedness and destabilized proper courtship. Still, the public read on. In fact, some prisoners wrote specifically for publication. One savvy inmate, jailed for petty theft, submitted a fake love letter to a tabloid under the pseudonym The Lonesome Ink. It was printed alongside a column titled, "What Women Want, Even from Thieves." He later admitted it was all a ploy to get noticed by a potential pen pal. It worked. He received 37 replies. Yes, that happened. Victorian prisoners had fan mail. The most famous example, a man nicknamed Sweet William, imprisoned in Manchester. After one of his letters, "The moon saw us kiss before the gallows took me," was published, women began writing in. Some sent photos, some sent flowers. One offered marriage. He accepted. The wedding was scheduled for 2 days after his release. The bride never showed up. Historians still puzzle over why people fell for these incarcerated poets. Was it the melancholy, the drama, the safety of loving someone locked up? Whatever it was, the emotional pull was strong enough to launch a full-on cultural phenomenon. Enter the prison romance column. For a brief time, several penny papers ran recurring features where the public could read selections of letters, real or edited, and sometimes even write back. Think of it as early matchmaking, with iron bars and dramatic metaphor. A sample letter might read, "To the girl who saw me by the window, your scarf was red. My heart still is," and beneath it, a note from the editor. If Miss R.T. of Bristol wishes to reply, she may send correspondence care of this publication. It was equal parts heartbreaking and ridiculous, and yet it worked. Some of these exchanges led to years-long correspondence. A few even turned into marriages, though whether those marriages survived is less documented. You flip through one last folder and find a clipping too wrinkled to read fully. But one line is clear. He may have stolen watches, but he gave his heart on time. You smile. Somewhere, between satire and sincerity, the tabloids captured something real. Maybe they mocked, maybe they sensationalized. But they also preserved voices that would have otherwise been lost. And maybe that's the oddest, most comforting twist of all. Because a love letter once printed and passed around is no longer just personal. It becomes folklore. You step out of the archive room, brushing specks of dust from your coat, as if shaking off centuries. The hallway echoes again with its familiar stillness, but your thoughts are already somewhere else, somewhere stranger, quieter, and even more desperate. Because long before dating apps, long before Lonely Hearts Radio or newspaper personals, prisoners were crafting something uncannily similar. The pen pal plea. You've now reached the chapter of Victorian prisoner dating ads. Yes, really. Also known in hushed whispers as the proto-Lonely Hearts clubs of the incarcerated. Picture it, a prisoner alone in a 6-by-8-foot cell, deciding that maybe, just maybe, someone out there in the world might want to exchange letters. And if not, well, maybe they'd at least send socks. The ads were rarely published directly by prisoners, of course. There were laws against that. But with the help of sympathetic relatives, bold chaplains, or very entrepreneurial friend of a friend types, these appeals for affection slipped into local classifieds, or the correspondence columns of fringe periodicals. One ad, printed in the back pages of the Penny Companion in 1887, read, "Gentleman, 32, enjoys carpentry and clear skies, seeks friendship of a modest, letter-loving woman, location unimportant, must dislike silence." That gentleman was serving a 5-year sentence for highway fraud. Another wrote, "Imprisoned, but not unfeeling. Wishes to exchange letters with a lady of virtue and imagination, partial to rhubarb tarts and poetry." He got 17 responses. One came with a handkerchief embroidered with a single word, "soothe." Historians still debate how common this practice really was. Some say it was rare, a curiosity. Others suggest it was more widespread than documented, carried out through whispered networks and carefully managed return addresses. What's certain is that, however awkwardly, the human need to connect was too strong to be caged. Some prisoners offered poetry in trade, One promised a fresh verse weekly to anyone who wrote back. Another, more confident, guaranteed a full sonnet cycle by spring. You pass a cell where someone had once drawn hearts in a perfect row along the brick. Beneath them, the faint letters, 3 replies, 2 duds, 1 maybe. Occasionally these connections made it into formal prison reform records, usually under the title improper communication, but not all administrators were horrified. One governor at Holloway, oddly supportive, noted that female inmates exhibit improved temper after receiving replies to innocent letters. He even encouraged an anonymous pen pal box experiment for 2 months. One woman, imprisoned for petty theft, sent a letter asking simply, "What does your garden look like? I miss colors." She received a reply from a school teacher in Sussex, who described in tender detail every flower in her yard, ending with, "I will plant something yellow just for you." They wrote for 5 years. Some of the most remarkable exchanges came from illiterate prisoners, who dictated their feelings to fellow inmates. You can imagine the scene. One man pacing nervously, trying to remember how to say "you remind me of the sky before snow," while the other scribbles, nods, edits, and occasionally sighs. No, not that again. There are stories of friendships, romances, and even full-blown long-distance courtships forming through these exchanges. One pair, prisoner and pen pal, spent a full year debating Shakespeare's Twelfth Night before realizing they were in love. They married 6 weeks after his release. The wedding invitation read, "It began with a comma and now ends with vows." Of course, not all stories ended so poetically. One man faked his entire backstory, claimed to be a wrongly accused schoolteacher. His pen pal discovered the truth, wrote a scathing final letter, and published the entire exchange in a local paper under the title, "Love and Lies in Cell 9. The drama was exquisite, and yet for every failed match, or awkward poem, there were moments of genuine comfort. The letters weren't always about love. Sometimes they were about weather, or recipes, or books, or nothing at all, just something to read that didn't come from the warden's clipboard. Even the act of hoping someone might write back was enough to lift the fog off a dreary week. It gave inmates something to clean their hands for, something to comb their hair for, even if no one was watching. Historians today are fascinated by these connections. Were they acts of manipulation, emotional survival strategy, or sincere attempts to build a bridge from confinement to the world outside? Most agree, a little of everything. You lean on a low stone wall where one prisoner once kept a running list etched into the brick, just initials and dates, each one a letter received. Some are crossed out, others circled. One is marked with a heart, another with an X, and the note asked for boots. You imagine him staring out the window slit, wondering if that last reply meant something more, and maybe it did, because even now, as you walk these quiet halls, the air feels charged with unwritten letters, with the steady hope that someone, anyone might one day write back. You leave behind the pen pal exchanges and make your way toward a dim corridor marked Clergy and Reform. The air is colder here, the walls more echo than stone. This is where the reformers used to meet, the chaplains, inspectors, and activists who peered into the prison system and asked, "Are these walls enough, or too much?" And when it came to love letters, the question wasn't just whether they should be allowed, but whether they were corrupting or redeeming. Yes, you've reached the battlefield of Victorian reform debates. Did romantic correspondence uplift prisoners, or lead them further into sin? It's a fair question, if you're the kind of person who uses the word sin a lot in meetings. On one side were the moralists. Letter writing, they believed, was a distraction, a manipulation, a loophole through which lust, deceit, and rebellion could slip. Some went as far as to say that a well-written love letter from a prisoner was proof of moral decay, not affection. One magistrate in 1875 declared, "There is nothing more dangerous than a charming criminal with a pen. Their ink is venom." Charming criminals imagine that. But the other side, the reformers, the thinkers, the softer-eyed clergy. They saw something different. They believed writing letters, especially love letters, was proof of the prisoner's humanity. An attempt to reach toward goodness, toward connection. They saw each envelope as a stitch in the fabric of reform. One chaplain named Elias Broom kept an entire drawer of letters he called the Archive of Regret and Hope. He believed that if a man could write, he could change. If he could say, "I miss you," or "Forgive me," he wasn't lost yet. Historians still debate whether Broom was sentimental or visionary, probably both. One thing's certain: his drawer is now preserved in a university archive, filled with trembling script, smudged hearts, and the occasional inked drawing of a cat, for reasons unclear. Prison reformers often held up specific letters as examples in their speeches, proof that the system needed gentleness, not just punishment. One woman stood before Parliament with a folded page written by a teenage pickpocket to his mother. It read simply, "I'll come back different. I promise." Put the kettle on. The room went quiet. But of course, not everyone was swayed. Critics claimed that many letters were deceptive, prisoners writing to manipulate, to seduce, or to gain privileges, and there were cases to back that up. One famous example: a man named Vincent Locke, imprisoned for fraud, wrote to over 20 women, using the same paragraph, copied by hand. He was discovered when two recipients met at a local reading club, and realized they had received nearly identical metaphors about moonlight and marmalade. Vincent was punished, not for fraud, but for romantic insincerity. A charge that exists in exactly one prison document, and nowhere else in English law. So what's the truth? You pass a hallway lined with notices once posted by wardens. Some forbid letter writing, others regulate it. A few even encourage it, as long as it is chaste, constructive, and focused on domestic matters, which, let's be honest, eliminates at least 60% of decent poetry. But it wasn't just officials who wrestled with this question. Families had their own concern. Mothers feared that prison letters would drag daughters into shameful unions. Siblings worried about being used for money or favors. Some women even disguised their replies, sending letters under false names, or through friends, just to avoid gossip. And yet, the letters kept coming, because while some were manipulative, others were filled with raw, unpolished grace. A man describing his lover's laugh as the only song I remember. A woman writing to her imprisoned sister, "You are not what you did, you are what I still see." Reformers latched onto these moments. They pointed out that letter writing taught empathy, improved literacy, gave prisoners something to look forward to, and reminded them daily that someone was watching, waiting, hoping. And yes, it complicated discipline. In one case, a prisoner refused to report to duty unless he was allowed to finish a letter. The warden gave him 5 minutes. He used 6. That letter, now famous, ends with, "Forgive my lateness." The words were stubborn. Like me, you turn a corner into the chapel. Empty now, save for a few rusting candlesticks and dust-choked pews. On the pulpit is an open Bible, real or replica, with a faint inscription in the margin. She said yes. May 17th. A wedding proposal, snuck in by a guard. A prisoner turned preacher's note. No one knows, but someone wrote it, and someone, somewhere replied. Historians remain divided on whether romantic letters prolonged reform, or simply offered distraction. But most agree that at the very least, they reminded prisoners and those watching from outside that even within punishment, the human heart continues to write, because love, however flawed, is still a form of hope. You exit the chapel and drift into one of the oldest wings of the prison, a narrow hallway, where the bricks no longer line up quite right, where every step echoes as if the walls themselves are remembering footsteps. This is where time lives, and it's where we find the remains of letters that have been lost, found, and occasionally forged. Because while we've spent the night exploring the power of love letters from prisoners, those written with soot and sorrow and smuggled past suspicion, it's time to face an uncomfortable truth. Not every letter was what it seemed. Some were misplaced, others destroyed, and a few were fabricated entirely. You stand beside a rusted locker marked "Evidence Miss." Inside, neatly stacked in a cracked leather box, are several letters recovered decades after the prison closed. They were found tucked inside the chimney of a condemned cell. Experts believe they were hidden by a prisoner named Harriet Vale, sentenced in 1889 for setting fire to a lace shop. Harriet never mentioned her letters in court, never asked about them. But there they were, 22 folded pages, browned with soot, still faintly scented with something like rosewater and regret. Most were addressed to L.R., and signed with only a single symbol, a crescent moon. Historians still debate who was L.R., a lover, a sister, a shared cellmate. One theory suggests Harriet never sent the letters because she never intended to. Writing them may have been the point, a private ritual, a way of remembering someone without the risk of reaching them. But not all stories are so gentle. You sit down beside a crate filled with questionable correspondence, a term only Victorian bureaucracy could make sound both thrilling and boring. Inside are letters with obvious inconsistencies, phrases that don't match the time period, ink not consistent with the cell's known material, entire pages that appear to be, well, fiction. Yes, we've arrived at the era of forged prison letters, sometimes created by outsiders, other times by the prisoners themselves. And the reasons? Oh, they varied wildly. One forgery, uncovered by accident in the 1930s, turned out to be the work of a man named Arthur Langdon, who had never served time but published an entire book of letters from prison that he claimed were found in a wall during renovation. The book sold moderately well, especially one letter describing a prisoner's dreams of turning into a bird and flying to his lover's window. Lovely image. Completely made up. When confronted, Langdon reportedly said, "I never claimed they were mine. I merely gave them a home." Then there were the prisoners who forged their own love letters, sometimes to gain sympathy, other times to appear more human to wardens or parole board. A few simply forged them for emotional survival, writing replies to themselves, folding them carefully, and rereading them at night, as if the words had arrived from the outside. One man even went so far as to create multiple personalities in his correspondence, a sweetheart named Anna, a jealous rival named Bertie, and a disapproving aunt named Maeve. He used different handwriting styles, different inks, and assigned each a distinct perfume by dipping the paper in diluted oils. When a chaplain finally asked how he managed it all, the prisoner smiled and said, "Sometimes you need a whole cast just to survive the script." And then of course there are the letters we'll never know the truth of. You unfold one now, it's paper soft, its ink pale, it's addressed to "My lantern in the fog," and signed "Always." The handwriting is elegant, almost too elegant. The wording feels rehearsed, but the ache within it, that feels real. If this letter finds no one, then let it find the wind. No record exists of this letter's recipient. No evidence confirms it was written by a prisoner, but it was found beneath a floorboard, wrapped in cloth, beside a ring made from twine and a copper button. That has to count for something. Historians, surprise, surprise, still argue whether it's authentic. Some claim it's a 20th century, others believe it's a relic of love that simply outlasted its address. But maybe the truth lies not in the ink but in the intention. Because to forge a letter, whether out of loneliness or longing, is still to admit that a part of you wants to be read, wants to be heard. And in that way, even a fictional letter carries emotional weight. It becomes real in its own strange act. You stand now in a forgotten cell, with faded names scratched into the walls, wondering how many messages were swallowed by time, eaten by fire, crumbled by damp, or simply lost in the shuffle of bureaucracy. How many letters were never answered, how many replies were never delivered, and maybe how many were never written. but should have been. One final file rests on a nearby shelf. Letters without sender. Pages written by inmates but never addressed, just beginning. To you, or if I could speak freely. Followed by lines that trail off into smudges and space. You read one quietly. I dreamed last night that you were waiting at the gate. I woke up smiling. That's the cruelest thing, I think, that I smile. You fold it back and place it where it was, careful not to disturb the silence, because whether a letter is sent, received, forgotten, or forged, its existence still whispers. I tried, I remembered, I hoped, and in a place built to bury all that whisper means everything. You come now to the final hall, bare stone and flickering candlelight, quiet as breath, long as memory. The letters are behind you, scattered in dusty files and smoky corners. But one still waits. One that was sent, one that arrived, one that was read, remembered, and kept. It's 1890. You're seated beside a man named Ellis Rowe. Thin, pale, hands calloused from years of stone breaking, eyes softer than they should be. His sentence ends tomorrow. He hasn't spoken much in days. But tonight, he's writing one last letter. A goodbye, or maybe a beginning. You watch his hand move slowly across the page, the words forming carefully, as though the pen is heavier than it used to be. My dearest, if you're reading this, I suppose the road has already changed beneath my feet. I've no idea whether you'll be waiting at the gate, or if your heart has wandered elsewhere. I would understand, but I want you to know this letter has taken me years to write. I started it in pieces. A line here, a word there, a dream I kept folded in the lining of my coat. I rewrote the first paragraph 12 times before I realized it didn't matter how it began, only that I meant it. You once told me that silence is a kind of language, that the pauses between our conversations said as much as our words. If that's true, then this place has been shouting at me in silence for 6 long years, and through it, I have thought of you. I've remembered your hands, not just how they felt, but what they did, picking flowers, buttoning my coat, reaching for a book I wouldn't finish. I've remembered your laugh, especially when it surprised even you. I've remembered your voice, saying my name in the morning like it still belonged to something kind. And I've remembered your letter, the one you wrote after my trial. You said, "Come back with more of yourself than you took away." I've tried. Every day. I'm not who I was, that's the truth, plain and dusty. I won't say I've become a saint, but I have become someone who can love without breaking the thing he loves. I didn't know how to do that before. This letter carries nothing with it. No request, no expectation, just a name and a small hope. If you're still there, if the road hasn't wandered too far, if your window still faces east, then maybe we could walk the long way home. And if not, know this, you kept something alive in me when everything else went quiet. I held on to that, yours in all the ways I didn't know how to be before. Ellis. He seals the letter, not with wax, but with thread, 2 stitches through the fold, tied in a small knot. It's quiet, the kind of quiet that follows closure, or forgiveness, or the first deep breath, after years of shallow one. He leaves it on the desk. The guard will collect it in the morning. And you stand now, in a cell emptied of man, but full of memory. You hear the echo of the paper, the scratch of pen, the hush of hope. You hear the voice of someone who tried, who failed, who learned to write again. Not just letters, but himself. And now, as the candle dies to a low golden hush, the story winds down. The halls grow softer now. You step back through the quiet corridors, past the bunk where a daisy was once drawn in soap, past the bench where poetry was borrowed for half a biscuit, past the bulletin board where envy hung in thumbtacks and chalk. The stories drift with you, faint and tender as old ink, like the kind of dreams you half remember but never quite forget. You don't need to read another letter now. You've heard them all, in the hush between footsteps, in the rustle of paper, in the echoes of laughter and regret. The prisons are still, but the voices linger, not loud, not demanding, just present. Soft declarations carved beneath bunks, a joke scratched into stone, a name whispered into folded pages that may never have arrived but were written anyway, because writing means remembering, and remembering means you haven't vanished. Not yet. So now, as the candles gutter and the cell doors sleep, you let the quiet take you. A deep, wide quiet, like dusk in a field, or the feeling of someone pressing a letter into your palm without speaking. The paper's warm. The ink is soft. You don't need to read the words. You already know them. It says, "You were here. You were loved." And somewhere that still matters. Close your eyes. Let the echo fade. Let the silence write the rest. Good night.